Welcome to Upwards, sponsored by the Microsoft Aspire Experience, where we share stories and insights to help you grow 1% better in your personal and professional life every episode. Here are your hosts for today's episode, Zach Zhu and Jay Lee.
Hello, Upwardians, and welcome to another phenomenal episode of the Upwards podcast. And I am back here today with my original co-host, Jay Lee. And now, Jay, I know we have a fantastic guest joining us today. Would you mind doing some lovely introductions?
Of course, Zach. Today on the podcast, we have with us Mr. Michael Bervell, who is a Ghanaian-American angel investor, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and writer, and a bunch of other things. So thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Would you mind giving us a brief background on all of who you are?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show, Zach and Jay. It's always fun to be on shows that you've listened to. Done a bunch of different things over the past couple of years. But as it relates to Microsoft, I currently work at M12, which is Microsoft's venture capital fund. So we invest in startups on behalf of the company directly off the balance sheet in the fastest growing companies in the world. It's a really cool, role, really cool industry, a really cool job, but wasn't at all what I imagined, coming into when I first came to Microsoft, just 2 years and 2 months ago. So it's still pretty new to this whole working thing, but it's a great place to work, M12 specifically. But I actually was born and raised and grew up just 30 minutes north of Seattle in this small town called Mill Creek, Washington. I went to high school in Mukilteo at Kamiak High School for people who might know about it. And I actually applied for my first Microsoft job when I was in high school. There was a high school internship program that I applied to, went to, did all the interview prep, learned Java, practiced all the interview questions, and then got rejected. So I think deep down, part of me is I didn't get the job when I was in high school. So even throughout college, even though I had different internships at Twitter, at different art museums, eventually even had a couple stints at startups, I still kind of wanted to be at a larger company like Microsoft where I could make a big impact, at least at the beginning of my career, to learn. So that was a bit about kind of how I saw Microsoft as a place that I would want to work. But outside of that, I was doing a bunch of different things. I made a nonprofit while I was in middle school. I made my first mobile gaming company when I was in high school. To pay for college, I made a consulting business that did consulting for restaurants in Harvard Square, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of things that I've been doing. I'm always kind of building along the way, but maybe I'll stop there and we can deep dive into any of those areas of my life to learn more.
I need to get some clarity. Are there 9 clone versions of you, or is there just one Michael Bervell?
There's actually 11. So yeah, one for every hour that I'm awake.
Nice, awesome. So going more into the learn, build, give cycle, because that's kind of how we decided to separate out your story today. If you could give us a little tidbit about what the learn, build, give cycle is from your standpoint.
I'll start with learn. When I was in high school, one thing I did was I listened to one TED Talk every single day my junior year, and I would read up a summary of the TED Talks. And probably my favorite tidbit of knowledge that I learned was from Steve Jobs' Stanford commencement speech, which I think someone had put on the TED website. And he says essentially the best way to grow is to first collect the dots and then focus on connecting the dots. Mm-hmm. Right. So when I think of learning, to me, it's what are you doing to actually get a broad understanding of the world? And then I look at building as trying to connect those broad understandings or those dots to create something usable. And the giving is, you can connect the dots, but how can someone else take the same dots or some similar dots and connect them to make something for themselves? So I'll give you a pretty clear example of the first time I had done this. I mentioned briefly I made a nonprofit when I was in middle school and ran it all throughout high school and college. And that nonprofit was actually inspired by my grandmother. She would raise me. My parents are both from Ghana. And so they were going to school when I was younger. And my grandmother would come in and take care of me while my parents were at work or were going to school. And she would always tiptoe into my bedroom at night and grab my old teddy bears and kind of take them to her room and stash them in a plastic bag. Right. And I was would wake up and be I've lost 3 teddy bears tonight. Monsters are real. There's a monster under my bed. Right? She wouldn't tell me what she was doing.
I love that.
But what was great is we started to realize that every year she would go back home to Ghana in, November, December, when it was really cold in the States, but still really warm in Ghana. And what she would do is take these stashed teddy bears that she'd taken from my siblings and I, and give them to kids at hospitals and orphanages and schools. So when she eventually, passed away, we wanted to do something to honor her memory and took that whole legacy of collecting teddy bears from kids in, our local school district and middle and high schools, and kind of took it to a new level. We weren't breaking into homes and stealing teddy bears, but we put up posters at our at our middle and high school and had people donate instead. And so in the last decade, that company was started in 2007, so it's been about 14 years. In the last decade and a half, we've done those trips to about 6 different countries: Ghana, Uganda, Tanzania, 2 or 3 other countries in Africa as well. But the reason I bring up that story is because I think it's a great model of the learn, build, give, right? The learning process was in realizing hey, it's actually pretty easy to put up posters in your high school and get 2,000 teddy bears, and to take this and give it to, students in another developing country, whether at a hospital or a school or an orphanage. The build idea behind it was, how can you take what we've learned and what we've learned in terms of how to actually implement this and make it into something scalable? And so we built out actually an executive board of, adults, right? People who were in college or maybe a little ways afterwards. We built out a senior board of high school students and a junior board of middle school students to essentially have this pipeline of philanthropy, what I call kind of voluntourism, where people were volunteering, but also doing tourism at the same time. And we built out that model. And the give aspect of this is, I could have, continued running that full time. I could have, instead of coming to Microsoft, just been a Hugs for Ghana builder. We now call it Hugs for Blank, where that blank is any country. But I decided instead, what can we be doing to empower our students to actually take ownership of the business themselves and to run the nonprofit themselves. And I think that theme of learning about some really niche industry, building it something scalable, and then giving it to the next generation to run on is something that I think really empowers me to want to, move forward and build out really amazing businesses, initiatives, or anything else. And I think it's a very scalable model that I would encourage others to look into as well.
So Michael, kind of taking that experience for building Hugs for, when you first came to Microsoft, how did you kind of reprocess that learn, build, give cycle into your job and into the Microsoft culture?
Yeah, the first thing I had to do was to reframe how I think of learning. Right? I think what most people do actually throughout college and beforehand, really anytime before your first job, learning by definition is the amount of new things that you can master. Right? Every semester, every quarter, you're going to a new class, and the goal is, in 12 weeks, can you study enough or cram enough to get an A on this exam, or get a 95% on your PSET? If you're me, it was anything above 70 is good, but for people who are really smart, they want to get 100%. And so that was one thing that I had to just reframe. Right? I went to college and studied philosophy, and that was one of those subjects where there is no clear answer, there is no mastery. Because you're looking at texts that are 2,000, 3,000 years old and trying to poke holes in them or trying to make them stronger with the argument. And there is no way in that sense of learning about the text, because there is no way to master the text or no way to really become an expert at the text. There's no true grade. It's all very subjective. So coming to Microsoft, I think I was very used to that ambiguity of not necessarily having a clear definition of when learning stops, because there was no exam in philosophy, right? For the most part, it was just writing. So the way that I reframed learning from mastery of new subjects was to think of learning at Microsoft or on the job is all about depth. If you want to be a good learner at Microsoft or really any corporation, you have to be an expert in your field. So whereas learning in college and before is all about novelty, learning in the working world is all about mastery. And so I came to Microsoft and was working as a PM on the Windows IoT team. That was my first role here. And I was thinking, do I want to be a master about Windows operating systems for Internet of Things devices? Some people are go to sleep and dream about smart light bulbs. That wasn't necessarily me. I was much more interested in leadership, community building, really connecting with people my age as well, since, that was a little tough. Luckily, the Microsoft Aspire program really helped with that, along with other things. And one of the first things I did at Microsoft was to think, what's a good way that I can learn from my peers and to become a master at, building friendships. And that's what led to a group called Growth Groups. The idea was, can I get 15 really cool people across Microsoft and get lunch with them once a week or dinner with them once a week and make a bunch of new really cool best friends, and in the process become a master at community building. And that's what I spent about a year and a half doing when I first came to Microsoft. I think at one point we had 1,500 concurrent members at once. All totaled, it's close to about 3,000 people have gone through in the last 2 years. And what that entails is just, again, meeting once a week with a bunch of really cool people over the course of 8 to 12 weeks and learning about curriculum that has to do with Microsoft's growth mindset or other curriculums that have to do with diversity and inclusion or ESG and so on and so forth. So that to me has been what I've seen as a really cool experience at Microsoft and how I'm continuing to learn at Microsoft in that kind of learn, build, give model. Now at M12, like my goal is to become a master at building really phenomenal teams at any scale, whether it's internal at Microsoft or external to the company. What can we be doing to support amazing startups and to build these amazing teams all over the world? And I'm slowly becoming, I'm not really a master yet. I'm still kind of a novice. I guess if this is like a video game, I'm level 3 out of like 99. Maybe I'll be like a level 4 soon, but slowly growing as I try to master that really niche area.
Circling back to the difference in learning that you said, where learning in college was more of a novel kind of activity versus in the workforce, it's all about mastery. I love how you have a philosophy background from Harvard, which is, I would say, I don't know if you would agree with this, but one of the more novel kind of subject matters that you can major in college, and would just love how you managed to like transfer that kind of perspective of just like learning so much about like the intuitive nature about how the mind works and how that applies to something as more concrete, like developing businesses, which is what you're doing with M12 now.
Yeah, it's so funny. I think my graduating class was 1,600 people from college. And I think of those 1,600, about 40 were philosophy majors. So it definitely was a really small department. I mean, we had like 40 professors. So pretty much any class you go to is like essentially tutelage, right? Either one-on-one or like maybe 5-on-1, very small classes. I think the benefit of philosophy is with small classes, right? With 5 people, it actually very much mimics what you'll see in like life as you go through meetings, right? Like if you go to a meeting, you're not going to be in a meeting with a 200 person. Like there's almost no case when you go to work and you're trying to convince 200 people of some truth. And I think that is what most of the lecture classes were like, at least at Harvard. Whereas most of my philosophy classes and some of the social sciences were much more like you would come with a paper, everyone would read your paper, and you spend the next 2 hours debating, your 3 or 4 peers' papers, which I think honestly is much more akin to what the actual working world is like. So it's almost strange because my argument is that any skill can be learned on the job, but it's super hard to learn how to persuade like an audience at scale, and even not at scale in a small group of 5 to 6. And that was like essentially all I learned to do through all of college, right? That, and also how to, make things up if you hadn't done the readings, which tends to happen quite a bit at work too.
Spark notes.
Exactly. But as it relates to Microsoft, I think I almost see venture capital, what I'm doing now, as a form of philosophy, right? Where philosophy is, you're trying to understand what the world is like. Like venture capital is you have a prediction of the world saying, I think in 5 years there's going to be self-driving cars and the infrastructure behind those cars has to live in the cloud. So I'm going to invest in a business that gets, smart technology into the cloud, even if you don't have connectivity, right? That might be your thesis, your philosophy for the world. And the way that you manifest it is by throwing capital at it. You'll say, okay, I'm going to throw $100 million into 20 different companies at $5 million each with the hope that one of them does well and actualizes to return my fund and then some. So in that sense, like philosophy is like venture, but in venture you have money and in philosophy you don't, right? And, sorry, philosophy professors or teachers. I do love the work that you've done though. And so it's pretty interesting to see that. And to me, they're very similar more than they are different. Even as a PM, I saw philosophy as very useful because I was always thinking like, what are the unspoken premises behind what people are saying or doing or, behind their actions? And I think philosophy, when you're reading Plato or Socrates, they're not going to say every single argument and lay it out for you. And so I, as a person, became much better at intuiting what the actual subliminal or implicit arguments were in a way that when I came to work and people were saying like, we need to do this project because it'll have X or Y returns, my thought was, well, what aren't you saying? And what are we missing? So it almost just made me a natural red teamer, where I was classically red teaming or trying to find the devil's advocate perspective of any argument or product meeting or anything else that might occur. So I know those are 3 kind of scatterbrained ways that philosophy kind of tied into my role at Microsoft. The small team learning, the red teaming just naturally, and then also philosophy applied through capital.
I was going to say that, going back to what Zach brought up earlier, your book, you seem to have truly merged your interest in philosophy and in venture capital. like a true philosopher, you wrote a book. And like a modern philosopher, I happen to know that you also have a blog on the side related to this book. So, Michael, would you mind telling us a bit more about either your book or the blog, and also about your interest in writing in general?
Yeah, I mean, this goes very much into the give kind of aspect of that model, right? Like I've learned a lot in the past, 23 years, almost 24. I've learned a lot. I've built a lot, right, of different companies and for myself. And like, I think of writing as a form of giving back in a very like meditative sense. And so the blog that I made about 2 years ago, and I've written on it almost every single day since. So I think there's 705 consecutive days as of today. But the blog is all about billion-dollar startup ideas. So every day I post a new billion-dollar startup idea, and the blog name is billiondollarstart-up-ideas.com. But what's been really fun about it is it's been a great way to stay creative, to write daily, and to get kind of these interesting thoughts and perspectives out into the world. And I'm writing about all sorts of different ideas. What would it look like if Robinhood had index funds? What's the future of reading books? Is there a way to make reading more social? How would you destroy Goodreads and create something new instead? Right? These are all just like random ideas that I run into. And my thought there is, every solution, every idea solves a problem. And every business is really just a solution that people are willing to pay for. And if you can solve a problem and get people to want to pay for it because it's such a good solution, then you have a business. And so that's how I started writing the blog. And then, that's kind of what led me to think, what would it take to actually make this into something that's more tangible than just a transient blog? So I looked at where all my readers were on this blog, and most of my readers were based out of India and Africa and Asia. About 60% of them were out of the US. And that's what got me thinking, what kind of book or content would these people really enjoy? And so, it got me thinking, like, what startup founders exist in the world? And maybe I'll ask this to you, Zach and Jay, like, name to me like 5 startup founders. Like, who's top of mind?
Well, I mean, obviously there's Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk,
Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. Yep.
Yeah, just all the big billionaires. I mean, Bill Gates. Ooh, probably should have said him first.
Well, I guess, Michael, the question is it like current startups or past startups? I guess everything started as a startup.
Oh, everything was a startup at one point. But I think the bigger premise is if you look at the 5 people that we just named, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos. I mean, I think there is a 5th. Let's throw like Richard Branson in there because he's pretty popular too. They're all pretty much just white guys, right? And if you're writing to a blog that's global and you're thinking, I'm going to write about startups, you can't just write startup stories about the 5 most popular or 10 most popular, 15 most popular, mostly white, mostly male executives in the world, right? And so that was the premise behind the book. Where are people of color building? Where are female entrepreneurs building? And how can I tell those stories in a really unique and interesting way? So the book just published actually about a month and a half ago. It's got some good traction, which is awesome. For a time, it was a #1 new release on Amazon, which is great because it means that people liked it and bought it. But the whole premise is, what are the startup stories of startup founders in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East? And the book is called Unlocking Unicorns, because a unicorn in startup culture is like $1 billion company. And it was a really fun, phenomenal journey to interview executives directly and also their teams, and also to learn about a bunch of really diverse startup founders globally in a bunch of different regions. Learning about what does it take to build a startup in Southeast Asia, where, if you want to scale, you have to scale across, 15 different countries, where each country has its own jurisdiction and different languages and religions and cultures. Very different problems than scaling a business from Seattle to San Francisco, where everyone primarily has the same culture and speaks English. And so there actually were very unique insights as well in writing this book about how do you build a business in fragmented ecosystems, or even in ecosystems where you're not sure, what the legal structure will be like in the next 30 days or 60 days. So I think even more fascinating stories than the traditional stories of startup founders that we named before. There's this company called Careem, and they're Uber for the Middle East. And they were started by this guy who was a former McKinsey consultant, and McKinsey asked him to go make an office in Pakistan. And so he went to Pakistan and went to go look for all the billion-dollar companies in Pakistan and startups in Pakistan that McKinsey could consult for. And I think he found something like 3 or 4 companies. And this is in a country of like more than 200 million people, right? He found like barely like a dozen or even half a dozen companies. And so he went back to McKinsey and was like, hey, I'm quitting because I want to go build $1 billion company in Pakistan. So it's like definitely backfired. So like, McKinsey, I guess, don't
Sorry,
do that
McKinsey.
next time. But he left his job with his co-founder, also was a McKinsey guy, who actually was diagnosed at the time with a terminal brain disease. And he was like, I want to go do something with my life beyond just being a consultant. And the two of them got together and just started brainstorming, like, what's the biggest, highest impact thing that we can do to build a startup in the Middle East and North Africa region. And they came up with like Uber or private cars or just transportation for people in the Middle East. The reason I love the story is for two reasons. One, when Saudi Arabia allowed women to drive, Careem was one of the first taxi services to actually train women and get them behind the wheel. And if you look at people in Saudi Arabia and Careem users, they describe what's called a pre-Careem Saudi and a post-Careem Saudi, right?
Wow.
In the pre-Careem Saudi, it was like, if you're a woman, you really couldn't even go to the store without a sibling or a family member driving you there. In the post-Careem Saudi, you could either drive yourself, right, as a driver and make your own living and make your own wages, or you could actually open this app, select a female driver, and go anywhere that you wanted to go, right? Just culturally, there are differences in that sense. I thought that was a super fascinating, phenomenal story of the impact going from, we don't want to just work at McKinsey to go actually make an impact. The second cool story from Careem is that they were huge, super successful in the Middle East, to the point where Uber came to acquire them. And Careem could have probably said no, and probably, if anything, acquired Uber's operations in the Middle East. That's what Grab did in Southeast Asia. There's also the example of Didi in China that did something similar. But Careem intentionally chose to sell themselves to Uber because they wanted to create a liquidity event for a bunch of people in the region. And when Careem exited, they made more than 300 millionaires in the Middle East and North Africa region. And this was about a year and a half ago. And if you look at the statistics today of where there's the most venture capital activity in the Middle East, it's in Pakistan, almost entirely because of Careem and their decision to want to exit. So now all these former employees are investing in startups, making new startups, like creating venture funds. And they've taken this kind of country that no one really talked about in the startup ecosystem and put it on the map as one of the fastest growing, maybe second to Nigeria or India. So it's pretty fascinating just to see that. So I love that story in the book. And of course, there's more to the chapter of like how they did it and why they did it, some of the pitfalls, but those are the two really cool key lessons and examples.
And I think that fits into our theme
Got
perfectly.
Like chills right now.
Yeah. They went to Pakistan to learn, they built something amazing, and then they gave back to the community there.
That's exactly it. It's exactly it.
One more thing, Michael. So thinking about the examples that you gave, like your life, even Careem, the company there, it seems that everything you build and that you give back is all sustainable. So you used a term earlier where when you were describing billion-dollar startup ideas where you didn't want to build something that was just transient. So what does it mean to you to build something that's sustainable, and how do you go about doing it?
Yeah, I almost think of like the best and most amazing businesses are the ones that survive forever. And maybe this will be an interesting idea, but I can almost say like, if you look at like Amazon, not the company, but like the actual rainforest, you could almost say like that ecosystem, that the Amazon ecosystem is in itself a business, but you're not getting paid in cash, or people who exist in that ecosystem are paying in cash. They're paying and they're receiving based on how well they're able to make the ecosystem grow. And the success in the health ecosystem is the quote unquote reward, whereas traditionally like the reward would be for human life or in capitalistic society, whatever, you're getting paid money. So I always think of myself as thinking like, sure, you can make a couple dollars here and there. And, I put ads on the blog, and so that was, a way to make it sustainable in that sense. But how can you make this a sustainable movement that people want to contribute to and share, not just for their own gain, but just to help the whole ecosystem grow, right? I think even before I started publishing my blog, it was really rare to actually find high quality startup ideas online. And if you wanted to go make a startup, there was this secretiveness where it's like, I can't tell anyone my idea because they might steal it. And my whole aim with the blog, and the reason why I posted all very publicly, was to be able to change that narrative, to make an ecosystem where if you were to share an idea, it's not like you're losing out on dollars, but you're really just expanding and making the ecosystem of this rainforest, of this kind of global pie, larger. So that kind of is my thought on why I try to do these sustainable businesses. But I'd say if there's two key learnings, the first key learning is like, if it doesn't give you energy, leave happier with doing it, whether it's a job or a project or whatever else, you probably shouldn't be doing it. There's a bunch of things that people can spend their time on. There's like, quite frankly, an infinite number of things that people could be doing at any given moment. And if you're not at the end of the day looking back and saying, I'm happy I did these things for my last 16 hours, or I'm happy that my 10 clones did these things for the last 16 hours. It's probably not worth it. Right. So that's key lesson number one. I think key lesson number two is that it's so easy now to quote unquote find your tribe, right? Like find people who are like you, think like you, or like are interested in challenging the world in the same ways that you are. And with Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, like name any other social media platform that has communities, it's really easy to find a community to build something really impactful. And that's what I tried to do at Microsoft. And of course, the way I built that community for growth groups was thinking, what can we be doing to be a community of giving, of grit, of vulnerability, of communication, and of being 1% better every day. But in all of my businesses, I start with this niche community and try to scale out from there.
That's awesome. Very inspirational.
Absolutely nuts. I love how you have literally incorporated this learn, build, give concept in your life to the point where it's literally a lifestyle for you now. And you said that you're turning 24, and this is all what you've done so far with learn, build, give is absolutely astounding. But I'm just wondering, what is like the Magnum Opus kind of situation for learn, build, give for Michael Bervell?
I joked with a buddy of mine last week. He was like, "What is success for this book?" And I was like, "I'll be happy when I'm talking to a stranger and they bring up the book to me and they totally just rip it apart. They're like, this book is so terrible, terrible for all these reasons. Like, I don't even know what this author was thinking, blah, blah, blah." And then I'll be like, "Oh, that was me." That to me is success, right? When the lesson has outlived the speaker, right? Or when the narrative or the story has outlived the speaker. And so the Magnum Opus, I think for learn, build, give is like, I think it's a great kind of philosophy. I think it's one that I've adopted naturally, but I want it to be an earworm, or just kind of like a song that gets stuck in people's head, where they just are living it and they're doing it not because, this person said that it was a really good thing to do, but because they truly believe it's like naturally part of who they are and who they want to be and who they want the world to be. So that to me is success. Like if someone that I don't know on the side of the street comes up to me and says, "Oh, there's this learn, build, give thing that I heard in a podcast," I'm like, "That was me." But, I think it'd be fun anyways to just like hear that, to realize that it's reached beyond your direct network.
I have to ask one last question, though. You said within your give concept, the exact quote is, "Give back to those who made everything possible." My mentor once said to me that, quote unquote, "giving without expecting anything in return is one of the most powerful lessons anyone can learn and embrace." What does giving back to all those who made everything possible look like to you? And who are those individuals / groups?
I think there were so many sacrifices that people made that I know of and don't know of to get me to where I am. Obviously, there are things I know of my parents, choosing not to live in Ghana and choosing to immigrate to the US, when they probably could have been like significantly more, successful, maybe happier, maybe had like, more generational wealth, whatever it is, had they stayed in Ghana, and yet they chose not to. So I think that's like what I mean with the give concept, is so many people made sacrifices that you know of, but also like, what sacrifices did my great-grandparents make, or my great-great-grandparents make? Or like even working at Microsoft, right? There are probably people who made sacrifices, whether personal or professional, that have allowed you to sit where you are today. And all of those things, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think that whole ecosystem approach is why giving is so important, even if you don't know who you're giving to or what the outcome will be, because it all kind of comes back. I guess it's very karmic in that sense, but it all kind of comes back in a full circle.
That's awesome, Michael. Thank you so much for coming onto this podcast today and knowing a little bit more about you. It seems like you really love giving back to people. If our listeners today would want to get in contact with you, how would they do so?
Yeah, so definitely there's one really easy way to do it. I mean, just michaelbervell.com. My website doesn't change. And so you can just go to my website. There's a contact form. It links to all of my projects, the book, the blog. I'm currently doing research on how to have the perfect conversation. So just go there and hit contact me. And in the body of the email, you can reference 11 clones, and I'll know exactly what you're talking about.
And on that note, thank you so much, Michael. We loved having you on our podcast, and going back into our daily lives, we'll probably kind of sit a little bit more on the learn, build, grow cycle and see how we can make that just a little flutter of memory in our brains and not something we dwell on and actively pursue.
For sure. Definitely trying to incorporate the learn, build, give cycle into my own life as well. Thank you so much for the talk, Michael.
Thanks, guys, for having me.
Thanks for listening to Upwards. Be sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and leave us a review. Learn more about the Microsoft Aspire experience at aka.ms/Microsoft Aspire experience. We'll catch you next time on Upwards.